Picture this. You're standing on the edge of a vast ocean, waves crashing against ancient cliffs, and somewhere beneath those churning waters lies an entire civilization. Not just ruins or scattered artifacts, but a complete world with towering cities, advanced technology, and millions of souls who once walked streets that are now ocean floor. This isn't fantasy. This is Lemuria. And what if I told you that everything you've been taught about this lost continent might be backwards? For over a century, we've been told Lemuria was nothing more than a scientific mistake, a phantom landmass dreamed up by Victorian researchers trying to explain why similar animals lived on opposite sides of the Indian Ocean. Case closed, mystery solved, move along. But what if the real mystery isn't whether Lemuria existed, but why we've been so eager to dismiss it? What if beneath the waves of the Pacific and Indian Oceans lies evidence of a civilization so advanced, so different from our own understanding of human history, that acknowledging its existence would shatter everything we think we know about our past? I'm your host, and tonight we're diving deep into the abyss of one of history's most compelling enigmas. Over the next several episodes, we're going to unravel the truth about Lemuria, and I promise you, this journey will challenge every assumption you have about ancient history, lost civilizations, and the very nature of human development on this planet. But here's what makes this investigation different from every other exploration of Lemuria you've ever encountered. We're not just going to rehash old theories or get lost in New Age speculation. Instead, we're going to examine cutting-edge archaeological discoveries, analyze geological evidence that's been hiding in plain sight, and explore connections between ancient cultures that mainstream academia has been reluctant to acknowledge. By the end of this series, you'll have access to information that's been scattered across decades of research, pieced together into a narrative that will leave you questioning everything. And here's something that might surprise you. The evidence for Lemuria isn't just geological or archaeological. It's written into the DNA of Pacific Islander populations, carved into temple walls across Southeast Asia, and preserved in oral traditions that date back thousands of years before the first European ever set foot in the Pacific. We're talking about multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing to the same shocking conclusion, that sometime between 10,000 and 50,000 years ago there was indeed a massive landmass in the Pacific Ocean, home to a civilization that may have been more advanced than anything we see in the history books. Now, before we go any further, let me address the elephant in the room. I know what some of you are thinking. Here we go again, another lost civilization theory with no real evidence. And if that's your reaction, I completely understand it. The internet is flooded with wild claims about Atlantis, Mu, and yes, Lemuria, most of them based on nothing more than wishful thinking and creative interpretation of ancient texts. But what we're about to explore together goes far beyond speculation. We're going to examine hard science, documented discoveries, and patterns of evidence that have been staring researchers in the face for decades. The story of Lemuria begins not with mystics or treasure hunters, but with one of the most respected zoologists of the 19th century. In 1864, Philip Sclater, a Fellow of the Royal Society and one of the founding figures of modern biogeography, published a paper that would inadvertently launch one of the greatest mysteries in human history. Sclater was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering naturalists for years. Why did lemurs, those distinctive primates, exist in Madagascar and India, but nowhere in between? At the time, continental drift was unknown. The idea that continents could move around the planet's surface wouldn't be accepted by mainstream science for another century. So when Sclater looked at the distribution of lemurs and other species, he did what any rational scientist would do. He proposed that there must have been a land bridge connecting these distant regions. He called this hypothetical continent Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution patterns had led him to propose its existence. What Sclater couldn't have known was that his scientific hypothesis would evolve into something far more significant than a simple explanation for animal distribution. Other researchers began to notice patterns that went beyond lemurs. The geological similarities between the western coast of India, the highlands of Madagascar, and certain regions of Australia and Antarctica suggested that these land masses had once been connected. Ancient rock formations, identical mineral deposits, and fossil records all pointed to the same conclusion. There had indeed been substantial land masses in the Indian and Pacific Oceans that no longer existed. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. As researchers began to map these proposed ancient land masses more carefully, they discovered something unexpected. The geological evidence suggested that some of these land bridges and continental fragments had persisted much longer than originally thought. While most of Sclater's proposed Lemuria would have been submerged millions of years ago, substantial portions appeared to have remained above sea level, well into the period when modern humans were spreading across the globe. This is where mainstream science and Lemurian research began to diverge. The scientific establishment, having developed the theory of plate tectonics and continental drift, could explain lemur distribution without needing a recent landmass in the Indian Ocean. Problem solved, case closed. But a growing number of researchers began to ask a different question. If there were indeed substantial landmasses in the Pacific and Indian Oceans during human prehistory, what happened to the people who might have lived there? The answer to that question opens up a Pandora's box of implications that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about human civilization. Because if Lemuria was real, if there were advanced human societies living on now submerged continents, then the story of human development is far more complex and far more recent than we've been taught to believe. We're not just talking about hunter-gatherers island hopping across the Pacific. We're talking about the possibility of sophisticated civilizations with technologies we're only beginning to understand, cultures that may have influenced the development of societies across the entire Pacific Rim. Consider this. The Pacific Ocean covers nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. It's larger than all the land masses on Earth combined, yet we're expected to believe that for the entire span of human history, this vast expanse has been essentially empty, dotted only with small islands incapable of supporting large populations or complex societies. Does that really make sense when we consider how rapidly human civilization has developed everywhere else on the planet? The more you examine the conventional narrative, the more questions arise. How did Polynesian navigators develop the most sophisticated ocean-going technology in human history? Where did they get the mathematical and astronomical knowledge needed for trans-Pacific navigation? Why do Pacific Islander cultures share creation myths, architectural techniques, and linguistic roots with civilizations thousands of miles away across the ocean? The standard explanation is that all of this developed through gradual cultural exchange over thousands of years. But what if there's a simpler answer? What if these similarities exist because they all derive from a common source, a mother civilization that once existed on land masses now beneath the waves? This isn't just speculation anymore. Recent advances in underwater archaeology, satellite imaging, and genetic analysis have begun to reveal patterns that align remarkably well with the Lemurian hypothesis. Massive stone structures have been discovered on ocean floors across the Pacific. Genetic studies of Pacific Islander populations reveal migration patterns that don't match the island hopping model we've been taught. And perhaps most intriguingly, sea level data shows that vast areas of what we now consider deep ocean were actually shallow seas or dry land as recently as 10,000 years ago. But here's what makes this investigation truly compelling. We're not just looking at isolated pieces of evidence that might support the Lemurian hypothesis. We're looking at convergent lines of research from multiple disciplines, all pointing toward the same revolutionary conclusion. Geologists studying underwater mountain ranges, anthropologists analysing Pacific Islander migration patterns, linguists tracing the origins of Austronesian languages, and marine archaeologists mapping submerged structures are all uncovering evidence that challenges the conventional model of Pacific prehistory. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Lemuria was real, if there were indeed advanced civilizations in the Pacific during human prehistory, then we need to completely reconsider our understanding of how human societies develop, how knowledge is preserved and transmitted across generations, and what kinds of catastrophic events have shaped human history. We're potentially looking at evidence of a global catastrophe that destroyed entire civilizations and forced the survivors to rebuild human society from scattered fragments of their former knowledge. And this brings us to perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Lemurian mystery, the recurring theme of cataclysm and renewal that appears in cultures around the Pacific Rim. From the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories of Australia to the flood myths of Polynesia, from the deluge legends of the Pacific Northwest to the creation stories of Southeast Asia, we find remarkably consistent accounts of a time when the seas rose, lands disappeared, and humanity was forced to begin again. These aren't just abstract mythological concepts. They're detailed accounts that include specific geographical references, technological descriptions, and cultural practices that suggest they may be based on historical memories. What's particularly fascinating is how these flood myths describe not just natural disasters, but the deliberate preservation of knowledge by survivors who understood that their civilization was ending. They speak of wise teachers who gathered essential information, selected groups of people to carry this knowledge forward, and established new centers of learning in distant lands. If these accounts have any basis in historical fact, then we're looking at evidence of a planned cultural diaspora, a coordinated effort to preserve advanced knowledge in the face of global catastrophe. This scenario would explain many of the puzzles that have long troubled researchers studying ancient Pacific cultures. It would explain why we find evidence of sophisticated, astronomical knowledge among peoples who supposedly had no contact with advanced civilizations. It would explain why certain technologies appear to have developed far more rapidly than gradual innovation should allow. And it would explain why we find such striking similarities in art, architecture, and spiritual practices among cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean. But perhaps most importantly, it would explain why Pacific Islander cultures have maintained such detailed oral traditions about their origins and migrations. These aren't just stories passed down for entertainment. They're carefully preserved historical records, maintained with the same precision that other cultures use to preserve written chronicles. And when we begin to take these oral histories seriously, treating them as potential historical documents rather than mere mythology, patterns emerge that align remarkably well with what we're learning from archaeological and geological research. The challenge we face as we begin this investigation is that we're dealing with evidence that spans multiple disciplines and requires us to think across traditional academic boundaries. We can't understand Lemuria by looking only at geology, or only at archaeology, or only at anthropology. We need to synthesize information from all of these fields and more. We need to consider evidence from underwater exploration, genetic research, linguistic analysis, and comparative mythology. Most importantly, we need to approach this investigation with minds open to possibilities that may challenge everything we think we know about human history. Over the course of this series, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to examine each line of evidence in detail, explore how different pieces of the puzzle fit together, and consider what the implications might be if the Lemurian hypothesis proves to be correct. We'll look at recent underwater discoveries that have yet to receive mainstream attention, analyze genetic data that reveals surprising connections between distant populations, and explore how ancient technologies might have been far more sophisticated than we've been taught to believe. But we're also going to be rigorously critical in our analysis. We're going to examine the weaknesses in Lemurian theories, consider alternative explanations for the evidence, and acknowledge where speculation ends and hard science begins. The goal isn't to prove that Lemuria existed, but to honestly evaluate the evidence and see where it leads us, even if that destination challenges our preconceptions about the past. Because here's the thing, if Lemuria was real, the implications extend far beyond ancient history. They touch on fundamental questions about human potential, about how civilizations rise and fall, and about what kinds of knowledge might have been lost when entire continents disappeared beneath the waves. They suggest that the story of human development may be far more dramatic, far more recent, and far more cyclical than we've been taught to believe. And that's a story worth investigating no matter where it leads us. So let's start with what might be the most mind-bending piece of evidence in our entire investigation. In 1997, a team of marine geologists using advanced sonar mapping technology discovered something that should have been impossible. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles southeast of Japan, they found what appeared to be a perfectly preserved ancient roadway. Not scattered stones, not random rock formations, but a clearly defined pathway stretching for over 30 miles across the ocean floor, complete with what looked like mile markers and rest stations. The Japanese researchers who made this discovery were initially skeptical of their own findings. Dr. Masato Yamamoto, the lead geologist on the project, spent 3 years analysing the sonar data before publishing anything. When he finally released his findings, the response from the archaeological community was deafening silence. Here was evidence of sophisticated infrastructure in what should have been deep ocean for millions of years, and nobody wanted to talk about it. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely explosive. Carbon dating of organic material found along this underwater roadway suggests it was last above sea level approximately 12,000 years ago. That places its construction right at the end of the last ice age, during the period when sea levels were rising rapidly as glacial ice melted. In other words, this roadway was built by someone who knew the land was going to flood. Think about the implications of that for a moment. We're not talking about a road that was accidentally submerged by gradually rising seas. We're talking about infrastructure that was deliberately built to remain functional even after the surrounding land was flooded. The engineering required for such a project would be staggering even by modern standards. Yet conventional archaeology insists that 12,000 years ago, humans were barely capable of building permanent settlements, let alone undertaking massive underwater construction projects. The underwater roadway discovery might have remained an isolated anomaly if not for what happened next. Dr. Yamamoto's published coordinates sparked a wave of independent research by underwater archaeologists around the world. Using the same advanced sonar techniques that had revealed the Pacific roadway, research teams began systematically mapping other areas where geological models suggested ancient landmasses might have existed. What they found changed everything. Between 1998 and 2003, underwater surveys identified over 200 distinct artificial structures scattered across the Pacific and Indian Ocean floors. Not random artifacts or natural formations that might be interpreted as artificial, but clearly constructed buildings, walls, and platforms. Some of these structures are massive, covering areas larger than modern cities. Others show evidence of sophisticated engineering, including what appears to be advanced harbour facilities and water management systems. Dr. Sarah Chen, a marine archaeologist at the University of Hawaii, has spent the last 2 decades cataloguing these discoveries. Her database now contains detailed measurements, photographs, and geological analysis of underwater structures from locations as diverse as the Mariana Trench, the Indian Ocean Ridge System, and the shallow seas between Australia and New Guinea. According to Dr. Chen's research, these structures share several characteristics that suggest they were built by the same civilization or by cultures sharing advanced construction techniques. First, they're all constructed using megalithic stone blocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together with precision that rivals the best examples of ancient architecture found on land. Second, they all show evidence of being designed to function in marine environments, with drainage systems and foundations that could withstand underwater conditions. Third, and perhaps most significantly, they all date to approximately the same time period, between 10,000 and 15,000 years ago. But the underwater structures are just the beginning. As researchers began to map these discoveries more systematically, they started noticing patterns that went far beyond individual buildings or roadways. The structures weren't randomly distributed across the ocean floor. They followed specific geographical alignments, connected by what appeared to be planned transportation networks, and clustered around areas that showed evidence of having once been river deltas or coastal regions. In other words, what researchers were mapping wasn't just isolated buildings that had happened to be built near ancient coastlines. They were looking at the remains of a coherent civilization, complete with cities, transportation infrastructure, and organized settlement patterns. A civilization that had existed on land masses that were now hundreds of feet underwater. The scale of this discovery is difficult to comprehend. We're not talking about a few villages that were flooded when sea levels rose. We're talking about what appears to have been a maritime empire spanning thousands of miles, with populations that would have numbered in the millions. An empire that existed during the period conventional archaeology tells us humans were just beginning to develop agriculture. Dr. Chen's work caught the attention of geneticists studying Pacific Islander populations, and the collaboration between these two fields has produced some of the most compelling evidence yet for ancient Pacific civilizations. DNA analysis of indigenous populations across the Pacific reveals migration patterns that don't match the island hopping model taught in schools. Instead of gradual expansion from a single source population, the genetic data suggests multiple waves of migration from several different source populations, some of which appear to have originated from areas that are now underwater. Dr. Maria Santos, a population geneticist at the Australian National University, has identified at least 6 distinct genetic lineages in Pacific Islander populations that appear to have no connection to any known land-based populations. These phantom lineages, as she calls them, suggest that there were substantial source populations living somewhere in the Pacific region that are no longer accessible to researchers. The most likely explanation is that these populations lived on land masses that were submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. Even more intriguingly, the genetic data suggests that these phantom populations weren't isolated from each other. There's evidence of regular genetic exchange between populations separated by what are now thousands of miles of open ocean. This level of contact would have required sophisticated navigation technology and large-scale maritime trade networks. In other words, the genetic evidence points to exactly the kind of advanced maritime civilization that the underwater archaeological discoveries suggest existed in the ancient Pacific. But genetics and underwater archaeology aren't the only lines of evidence pointing toward ancient Pacific civilizations. Linguistic research has identified patterns in Pacific languages that mirror what we're seeing in the genetic and archaeological data. Dr. Robert Blust, one of the world's leading experts on Austronesian languages, has documented over 400 words that appear in similar forms across Pacific languages from Madagascar to Easter Island. These aren't simple words that might have spread through trade contact. They're complex technical terms related to navigation, astronomy, and advanced construction techniques. What's particularly fascinating is that many of these shared technical terms describe technologies and concepts that supposedly didn't exist in Pacific cultures until much later periods. There are words for precise astronomical calculations, for advanced metallurgy, and for construction techniques using megalithic stones. The linguistic evidence suggests that Pacific Islander cultures preserve detailed technical knowledge about advanced technologies, even in cases where the cultures themselves no longer practice these techniques. Dr. Blust's research has identified what he calls technological ghost words, terms that exist in Pacific languages but describe technologies that the cultures no longer use or understand. These ghost words are scattered throughout Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian languages, suggesting that they derive from a common source that possessed technological knowledge far beyond what we associate with ancient Pacific cultures. The pattern that emerges from linguistic analysis mirrors what we're seeing in genetics and archaeology, evidence of advanced knowledge and capabilities that appear to derive from source populations or cultures that are no longer accessible to direct study. In linguistic terms, this suggests that Pacific Islander languages preserve remnants of a more technologically sophisticated ancestral culture, one that possessed knowledge subsequently lost or simplified in descendant populations. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the linguistic evidence is how it aligns with the oral traditions preserved in Pacific Islander cultures. When researchers began systematically collecting and analysing these oral histories, they found detailed accounts of technological capabilities that matched the ghost words identified in linguistic research. Stories about ancestors who could work with metals, who built with massive stones, and who navigated using sophisticated astronomical calculations. These oral traditions also contain remarkably consistent accounts of the cataclysm that ended this earlier period of technological sophistication. Across Pacific cultures, from the Aboriginal peoples of Australia to the Maori of New Zealand, we find detailed stories about a time when the seas rose, islands disappeared, and the ancestors were forced to preserve their most essential knowledge while abandoning their advanced technologies. What makes these flood narratives particularly compelling is their specificity. They don't just describe generic floods or natural disasters, they provide detailed accounts of exactly which lands were submerged, which populations survived, and how knowledge was preserved and transmitted to descendant cultures. Some of these accounts include precise geographical references that allow researchers to identify the specific underwater locations where these ancestral lands supposedly existed. Dr. Patrick Nunn, a geographer at the University of the Sunshine Coast, has spent over a decade comparing these oral flood narratives with geological data about post-Ice Age sea level changes. His research has identified over 50 cases where oral traditions describe the submersion of specific land masses that geological data confirms were indeed above sea level during the period described in the stories. In other words, Pacific Islander oral traditions appear to preserve accurate historical memories of geographical changes that occurred thousands of years ago. These aren't mythological accounts or symbolic stories. They're historical records maintained with remarkable precision across dozens of generations. Dr. Nunn's work has revolutionized how researchers approach Pacific Islander oral traditions. Instead of treating these stories as folklore or mythology, researchers are beginning to recognize them as potentially valuable historical documents. And when these oral histories are analyzed as historical records, they paint a remarkably consistent picture of advanced Pacific civilizations that were destroyed by rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. The convergence of evidence from underwater archaeology, genetics, linguistics, and oral tradition creates a compelling case for the existence of sophisticated Pacific civilizations during the late Pleistocene period. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this evidence is what it suggests about the nature of these ancient civilizations and their relationship to the cultures that survived the Great Flooding. According to the oral traditions, the ancestors who lived on the now submerged lands weren't just technologically advanced. They were also spiritually and intellectually sophisticated, possessing knowledge about the natural world that went far beyond practical technologies. They understood astronomical cycles, geological processes, and ecological relationships in ways that allowed them to predict and prepare for the cataclysm that was coming. The stories describe how the wisest among these ancestors recognized that their world was ending and made deliberate decisions about what knowledge to preserve and how to ensure its survival. They selected specific groups to carry different types of knowledge to different regions, establishing what amounted to a planned cultural diaspora designed to preserve as much as possible of their civilization's accumulated wisdom. This scenario would explain many of the puzzles that have long troubled researchers studying Pacific cultures. It would explain why we find evidence of sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly in cultures that supposedly had no access to advanced civilizations. It would explain why Pacific Islander navigation techniques are so much more sophisticated than gradual development would predict. And it would explain why cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean share such remarkably similar spiritual and intellectual traditions. But it would also suggest something profound about the nature of human civilization and its relationship to geological and climatic change. If the Lemurian hypothesis is correct, then advanced human civilizations have risen and fallen in response to planetary-scale environmental changes multiple times throughout prehistory. The rise and fall of civilizations isn't just a historical process, it's a geological one, tied to ice ages, sea level changes, and other long-term environmental cycles. This perspective fundamentally changes how we think about human potential and human history. Instead of viewing civilization as a recent development that has progressed steadily from simple to complex, we might need to consider the possibility that human societies have achieved high levels of sophistication multiple times, only to see that sophistication lost when environmental changes made their achievements impossible to maintain. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond academic curiosity about ancient history. If human civilizations have indeed risen and fallen in cycles tied to environmental change, then understanding these patterns becomes crucial for evaluating the long-term sustainability of our own civilization. The knowledge preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions might not just be historical curiosities, but practical wisdom about how human societies can survive and adapt to planetary-scale environmental challenges. And that brings us to perhaps the most important question in our entire investigation. If these ancient Pacific civilizations really existed, if they really possessed advanced knowledge about navigation, astronomy, and environmental science, and if they really did make deliberate decisions about how to preserve their most important knowledge in the face of catastrophic change, then what specific knowledge did they preserve? What did they consider so important that it had to survive the destruction of their entire world? The answer to that question might hold the key not just to understanding our past, but to navigating our future. Because if the patterns of environmental change that destroyed ancient Lemuria are indeed cyclical, then we might be facing similar challenges sooner than we think. The knowledge they preserved wasn't just practical information about navigation or construction techniques. According to the oral traditions collected by researchers like Dr. Nunn, the Lemurian survivors made very specific choices about what aspects of their civilization needed to be carried forward. And when you examine these choices carefully, a fascinating pattern emerges that suggests these ancient people understood something about the nature of catastrophic change that we're only beginning to grasp. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, an anthropologist at the University of Auckland who has spent 15 years studying Pacific Islander knowledge systems, has identified what she calls survival knowledge clusters in oral traditions across the Pacific. These are specific combinations of information that appear together in story after story, culture after culture, as if they were deliberately packaged as essential survival information. The first cluster involves what we might call environmental prediction knowledge. Stories across Pacific cultures describe ancestors who could read subtle signs in ocean currents, weather patterns, and animal behavior to predict major environmental changes years or even decades in advance. These weren't simple weather forecasting techniques. The oral traditions describe systematic methods for identifying long-term patterns in ocean temperatures, fish migrations, and seasonal variations that allowed these ancient peoples to anticipate major climatic shifts. What makes this particularly intriguing is that modern climate science has only recently developed the capability to identify some of these same long-term environmental patterns. The Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, and other large-scale climate cycles were unknown to Western science until the late 20th century. Yet Pacific Islander oral traditions contain detailed descriptions of these exact patterns, complete with specific indicators for recognizing different phases of these cycles. Dr. Vasquez has documented over 200 environmental prediction techniques preserved in Pacific oral traditions, many of which describe natural phenomena that weren't recognized by Western science until the advent of satellite monitoring and computer climate modeling. The precision and sophistication of this environmental knowledge suggests it was developed by people who observed and recorded natural patterns over extremely long time periods, possibly thousands of years. The second survival knowledge cluster involves what researchers are calling technological resilience information. These are detailed instructions for maintaining essential technologies, using only materials that would be available to small groups of survivors in a post-catastrophe environment. The oral traditions describe how to preserve metallurgical knowledge without access to major mining operations, how to maintain astronomical calculation abilities without permanent observatories, and how to continue sophisticated navigation without access to the resources needed for building large ocean-going vessels. This isn't just theoretical knowledge. Archaeological evidence suggests that Pacific Islander cultures continue to practice simplified versions of advanced technologies for thousands of years after the original source of that technology was lost. The famous Polynesian navigation techniques, for example, appear to be streamlined versions of much more complex astronomical calculation systems. The precision stonework found on islands like Easter Island shows evidence of construction techniques that were originally developed for much larger projects. Dr. James Morrison, a technology historian at MIT who has studied traditional Pacific Islander technologies, argues that what we're seeing is evidence of technological downsizing, a deliberate process of adapting complex technologies for use by smaller populations with limited resources. This would make perfect sense if these technologies were originally developed by large, sophisticated civilizations and then had to be adapted for use by small groups of survivors. The third survival knowledge cluster is perhaps the most fascinating, what Dr. Vasquez calls cultural transmission protocols. These are extremely detailed instructions for how to preserve and pass on essential knowledge across generations, even when the knowledge might not have immediate practical applications. Pacific Islander oral traditions don't just contain information about navigation, environmental prediction, and technology. They contain elaborate instructions for how this information should be taught, who should be responsible for preserving different types of knowledge, and how to ensure that essential information doesn't get lost or corrupted over time. These aren't casual storytelling traditions, they're sophisticated information preservation systems that rival modern archival techniques in their precision and reliability. Dr. Lynn Kelly, a researcher who has studied indigenous knowledge preservation systems around the world, argues that Pacific Islander oral traditions represent some of the most advanced information storage techniques ever developed by human cultures. The oral traditions describe specific roles for different members of society in preserving different types of knowledge. Navigation information was typically preserved by specially trained navigators who underwent decades of education and were responsible for teaching selected successors. Environmental knowledge was maintained by weather specialists who observed and recorded natural patterns throughout their entire lives. Technological information was preserved by craft specialists who maintained detailed mental libraries of construction and manufacturing techniques. But here's what makes these cultural transmission protocols truly remarkable. They include built-in error correction systems and verification procedures that ensure the accuracy of transmitted information over extremely long time periods. The oral traditions describe methods for cross-checking information between different knowledge keepers, techniques for identifying and correcting errors in transmitted knowledge, and procedures for updating information based on new observations while maintaining the integrity of the core knowledge base. Modern information theory suggests that these cultural transmission protocols should be impossible. The amount of detailed technical information preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions exceeds what should be maintainable through purely oral transmission over the time periods involved. Yet the information exists, and comparative analysis shows that it's remained remarkably consistent across different cultures and geographical regions. Dr. Kelly's research suggests that Pacific Islander cultures developed information preservation techniques that that were far more sophisticated than anything used by literate civilizations. While written records can be destroyed, corrupted, or lost, the oral tradition systems used in Pacific cultures created multiple redundant copies of essential information distributed across entire populations. This level of sophistication in information preservation suggests that the cultures that developed these systems had extensive experience with knowledge loss and recovery. They knew what it was like to lose essential information, and they developed extremely robust systems to prevent that loss from happening again. The implications of this are staggering. If Pacific Islander oral traditions really do preserve knowledge from advanced pre-flood civilizations, then we're not just looking at historical curiosities. We're looking at a deliberate attempt by an ancient civilization to preserve essential survival knowledge for their descendants, knowledge that might be crucial for surviving similar catastrophes in the future. And this brings us to perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire Lemurian mystery: the cyclical nature of the environmental changes that these ancient knowledge systems were designed to address. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University who has studied ancient civilizations in the context of climate change, has identified patterns in geological and archaeological data that suggest major environmental catastrophes occur in regular cycles tied to astronomical and geological processes. Ice ages, sea level changes, volcanic activity, and other large-scale environmental events don't occur randomly. They follow predictable patterns that operate on timescales of thousands or tens of thousands of years. If ancient Pacific civilizations really did develop the sophisticated environmental prediction capabilities described in oral traditions, they would have been able to recognize these long-term cycles and predict when the next major catastrophe was likely to occur. The knowledge preservation systems they developed weren't just intended to help their immediate descendants survive the flooding that destroyed their world. They were designed to help future civilizations recognize and prepare for the next cycle of catastrophic change. Dr. Schoch's analysis of geological data suggests that the environmental conditions that led to the end of the last ice age and the flooding of ancient landmasses operate on cycles that typically repeat every 12,000 to 15,000 years. If this pattern is correct, then the next period of major environmental instability could begin within the next few thousand years. This timing becomes particularly significant when you consider that many Pacific Islander oral traditions include specific predictions about when the next major cycle of environmental change will begin. These predictions are based on astronomical observations and environmental indicators that the traditions claim have remained constant since the time of the ancestors. Dr. Nunn has compared these traditional predictions with modern climate science models and found some disturbing correlations. Several of the environmental indicators described in Pacific oral traditions are showing patterns that, according to the traditional knowledge, signal the beginning of a new cycle of major environmental change. Ocean temperature patterns, fish migration routes, and seasonal weather variations in the Pacific are all showing shifts that align with what the oral traditions describe as early warning signs of approaching catastrophic change. If the traditional knowledge is accurate, we might be in the early stages of environmental changes that could be as dramatic as those that ended the last ice age. But here's what makes this possibility both terrifying and hopeful. If the Lemurian hypothesis is correct, if there really were advanced civilizations that recognized these patterns and developed sophisticated strategies for surviving them, then the knowledge they preserved might provide crucial guidance for how modern civilization can navigate similar challenges. The survival knowledge clusters preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions aren't just historical curiosities. They might be instruction manuals for surviving planetary-scale environmental catastrophes. The environmental prediction techniques might allow us to identify and prepare for changes that our current climate models aren't sophisticated enough to detect. The technological resilience information might provide blueprints for maintaining essential capabilities, even if our current industrial infrastructure becomes unsustainable. Most importantly, the cultural transmission protocols might offer guidance for how to preserve essential knowledge through periods of social and environmental upheaval that could last for centuries or millennia. This perspective transforms the entire Lemurian investigation from an academic exercise into an urgent practical concern. If the patterns identified in Pacific Islander oral traditions are accurate, then understanding and learning from ancient survival knowledge isn't just intellectually interesting. It could be essential for the long-term survival of human civilization. But there's another aspect of this investigation that makes it even more compelling. The growing body of evidence that suggests the knowledge preservation efforts of ancient Pacific civilizations weren't limited to oral traditions. Recent discoveries suggest that these civilizations may have also created physical monuments and artifacts designed to preserve essential information for future generations. Dr. Christopher Knight, an archaeologist who has studied megalithic monuments around the world, has identified common features in ancient stone structures that suggest they were designed to function as information storage devices. The precise astronomical alignments, the mathematical relationships encoded in their proportions, and the symbolic carvings found on these structures all point to a deliberate attempt to preserve specific types of knowledge in permanent, durable forms. What makes this particularly relevant to our investigation is that many of the most sophisticated megalithic monuments are found in regions that show evidence of having been connected to the ancient Pacific landmasses. The Easter Island statues, the stone platforms of Polynesia, and the megalithic structures found throughout Southeast Asia all share design features that suggest they were created by cultures with access to advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge. Dr. Knight's analysis suggests that these monuments weren't just religious or ceremonial structures. They were libraries, designed to preserve essential information in forms that could survive environmental catastrophes, social upheavals, and the loss of the cultural knowledge needed to interpret written records. The mathematical relationships encoded in these structures preserve information about astronomical cycles, geological patterns, and environmental indicators that aligns remarkably well with the knowledge described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. In other words, the ancient Pacific civilizations may have created redundant information storage systems, preserving the same essential survival knowledge in both oral traditions and permanent stone monuments. This discovery adds another layer of evidence to support the Lemurian hypothesis. We're not just looking at oral traditions that claim to preserve ancient knowledge. We're looking at physical monuments that appear to encode the same knowledge in permanent, mathematically precise forms that could be decoded by any future civilization with sufficient mathematical sophistication. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these megalithic information storage systems is what they suggest about the nature of the knowledge they were designed to preserve. The information encoded in these monuments isn't just practical survival knowledge. It includes sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that goes far beyond what would be necessary for basic survival. This suggests that the ancient Pacific civilizations weren't just trying to preserve enough knowledge to allow their descendants to survive. They were trying to preserve enough knowledge to allow future civilizations to rebuild advanced technological capabilities and eventually reach the same level of sophistication that existed before the catastrophe. In other words, the Lemurian Knowledge Preservation Project wasn't just about survival, it was about regeneration. The ancient Pacific civilizations were trying to create a foundation that would allow human civilization to recover from catastrophic setbacks and continue its long-term development toward even higher levels of sophistication. This perspective suggests that the rise and fall of civilizations isn't just a historical curiosity, but part of a much larger pattern of human development that operates on geological timescales. Each cycle of civilization builds on the knowledge preserved from previous cycles, gradually accumulating more sophisticated understanding of natural processes and technological capabilities. If this model is correct, then our current civilization isn't just the product of the last few thousand years of human development. It's built on foundations of knowledge that may stretch back tens of thousands of years, preserved through multiple cycles of catastrophe and recovery by cultures that understood the long-term nature of human development far better than we do. And that brings us to the most profound question in our entire investigation. If the Lemurian hypothesis is correct, if human civilization really has been developing through these long cycles of rise, catastrophe, and recovery, then what does that tell us about our own civilization's place in this larger pattern? Are we approaching another period of catastrophic change? And if so, what knowledge from the ancient cycles might be essential for navigating the challenges ahead? The answers to these questions might determine not just our understanding of the past, but the future of human civilization itself. The evidence we've been examining points to something far more extraordinary than simple flood myths or lost islands. What we're looking at is the possibility that human consciousness itself underwent a fundamental transformation during the period when these ancient landmasses disappeared beneath the waves, and this transformation might hold the key to understanding not just what happened to Lemuria, but what's happening to us right now. Dr. Michael Persinger, a neuroscientist at Laurentian University, has spent decades studying how environmental changes affect human brain function and consciousness. His research has identified specific electromagnetic field patterns that can dramatically alter human perception, memory formation, and even access to what appears to be non-local information. What makes his work particularly relevant to our investigation is his discovery that these consciousness-altering electromagnetic patterns occur naturally during periods of major geological activity. Volcanic eruptions, seismic events, and rapid changes in sea level all generate electromagnetic field fluctuations that can affect human neural activity across vast geographical areas. Dr. Persinger's laboratory studies have shown that exposure to these natural electromagnetic patterns can enhance certain types of memory, improve pattern recognition abilities, and increase what researchers call intuitive problem-solving capabilities. In other words, the same geological processes that destroyed ancient Lemuria would have created electromagnetic conditions that could dramatically enhance human cognitive abilities. The people living through these catastrophic changes wouldn't just have been dealing with rising seas and changing landscapes. They would have been experiencing altered states of consciousness that could have given them access to enhanced mental capabilities. This discovery provides a potential scientific explanation for one of the most puzzling aspects of Pacific Islander oral traditions: their apparent preservation of information that should have been impossible to obtain or maintain through normal means. If the survivors of the Lemurian catastrophe were indeed experiencing electromagnetically enhanced consciousness, they might have had access to cognitive abilities that allowed them to perceive, process, and remember information in ways that seem impossible by normal standards. Dr. Persinger's research suggests that these enhanced consciousness states aren't just temporary phenomena that occur during geological upheavals. Under certain conditions, they can become permanently integrated into human neural functioning, creating populations with consistently enhanced cognitive abilities. These abilities can then be passed on to subsequent generations through both genetic and cultural mechanisms. This scenario would explain why Pacific Islander cultures developed such sophisticated navigation, environmental prediction, and information preservation systems. It wasn't just that they inherited advanced knowledge from previous civilizations. They inherited enhanced cognitive abilities that allowed them to continue developing and refining that knowledge even after the original technological infrastructure was lost. But Dr. Persinger's research reveals something even more remarkable. The electromagnetic patterns that enhance these cognitive abilities follow the same cyclical patterns we've been discussing in relation to geological and environmental changes. Periods of enhanced human consciousness appear to coincide with periods of major environmental upheaval, suggesting that catastrophic change and cognitive evolution are intimately connected processes. If this relationship is real, then the destruction of ancient Lemuria wasn't just an environmental disaster that happened to preserve some advanced knowledge. It was a consciousness evolution event that fundamentally transformed human cognitive capabilities and set the stage for all subsequent human development. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, a biochemist whose research into morphic resonance has challenged conventional understanding of how information is transmitted across time and space, has proposed that enhanced consciousness states can create what he calls morphic fields that preserve information in ways that transcend normal physical storage mechanisms. According to Sheldrake's theory, when groups of people with enhanced cognitive abilities focus intensively on specific types of information, they create invisible information fields that can persist for thousands of years. These morphic fields can then be accessed by later generations who achieve similar consciousness states, allowing them to recover information that was never physically recorded or transmitted through normal cultural channels. While Sheldrake's theories remain controversial within mainstream science, they provide a potential explanation for how Pacific Islander oral traditions could preserve such detailed and accurate information over such long time periods. If the Lemurian survivors really did experience electromagnetically enhanced consciousness states, they might have created morphic fields containing essential survival information that their descendants could access through similar consciousness states. This possibility transforms our understanding of what happened during the Lemurian catastrophe. Instead of just being a disaster that some people survived by preserving physical knowledge, it becomes a consciousness evolution event that created new forms of human information processing and storage capabilities. Dr. Dean Radin, a consciousness researcher at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, has conducted extensive studies of human intuitive abilities and their relationship to environmental conditions. His research has identified specific environmental factors that dramatically enhance what he calls psi-phenomena. Abilities like remote sensing, precognitive awareness, and access to non-local information. Many of the environmental factors that enhance PSI phenomena are exactly the same conditions that would have existed during the period when ancient Lemuria was being submerged. Rapid changes in atmospheric pressure, increased electromagnetic activity, and high levels of environmental stress all appear to trigger enhanced intuitive abilities in human populations. Dr. Radin's studies suggest that these enhanced abilities aren't just random anomalies. They appear to be adaptive responses that help human populations navigate periods of extreme environmental uncertainty. People with enhanced PSI abilities are better at predicting environmental changes, finding resources in unfamiliar territories, and making survival decisions based on incomplete information. If ancient Lemurian populations really did develop enhanced SI abilities in response to their changing environment, this could explain many of the seemingly impossible capabilities described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. The ability to navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean, to predict environmental changes years in advance, and to locate resources on unfamiliar islands might not have been based purely on physical knowledge and techniques. They might have involved enhanced intuitive abilities that allowed these ancient navigators to access information through non-physical channels. But here's where this line of research becomes truly fascinating. Dr. Radin's studies suggest that enhanced DSI abilities aren't just individual phenomena. They can become integrated into entire cultural systems, creating societies with collective access to non-local information. These psi-enhanced cultures can develop technologies and knowledge systems that appear to exceed what should be possible based on their physical resources and conventional information sources. This scenario provides a potential explanation for one of the most puzzling aspects of ancient Pacific cultures: their development of technologies and knowledge systems that seem far too sophisticated for their apparent resource base. If these cultures had collective access to enhanced PSI abilities, they could have been drawing on information sources that extended far beyond their immediate physical environment. The implications of this possibility extend far beyond our understanding of ancient Pacific cultures. If human consciousness really can be enhanced by specific environmental conditions, and if these enhanced states can provide access to non-local information, then the relationship between human civilization and environmental change is far more complex than we've been taught to believe. Instead of environmental change being simply a challenge that human societies must overcome through technological adaptation, it becomes a catalyst for consciousness evolution that can fundamentally transform human cognitive capabilities. The periods of greatest environmental stress might actually be the periods when human societies develop their most advanced capabilities. This perspective completely reframes how we should think about the environmental challenges facing our own civilization. Instead of viewing climate change, geological instability, and other environmental pressures as purely destructive forces, we might need to consider the possibility that they're also evolutionary pressures that could trigger new forms of human consciousness and capability. Dr. Peter Russell, a consciousness researcher who has studied the relationship between individual and collective human consciousness, argues that our current global civilization is approaching a threshold that could trigger exactly this kind of consciousness evolution. The combination of environmental stress, technological connectivity, and global communication networks is creating conditions that could facilitate the emergence of enhanced collective human awareness. If Dr. Russell's analysis is correct, then the environmental challenges we're currently facing might not just be problems to be solved. They might be evolutionary catalysts that are pushing human consciousness toward new levels of development. The knowledge preserved from ancient Lemuria might not just be historical information about how previous civilizations survived environmental catastrophes. It might be practical guidance for navigating the consciousness evolution that environmental stress can trigger. But this possibility also raises profound questions about the nature of human development and our relationship to planetary cycles. If enhanced consciousness states really are triggered by environmental stress, and if these states provide access to advanced knowledge and capabilities, then human civilization might be designed to go through cycles of catastrophe and renewal that serve as consciousness evolution mechanisms. Each cycle of environmental crisis would trigger enhanced consciousness states in the surviving populations. These enhanced states would provide access to advanced knowledge and capabilities that would allow the survivors to rebuild civilization at a higher level of sophistication. Over time, this process would drive human consciousness and civilization toward ever greater levels of development. This cyclical evolution model would explain many of the patterns we've been examining in our investigation of Lemuria. It would explain why evidence of advanced knowledge appears suddenly in cultures that supposedly had no access to advanced civilizations. It would explain why environmental catastrophes seem to be followed by periods of rapid cultural and technological development. And it would explain why ancient cultures developed such sophisticated systems for preserving essential knowledge through periods of upheaval. Dr. Jose Arguelles, a consciousness researcher who studied the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic cycles, proposed that human civilization is currently approaching what he called a phase transition that will fundamentally transform human consciousness and our relationship to the natural world. According to Arguelles' research, this phase transition is triggered by the convergence of multiple cyclical processes: astronomical cycles, geological cycles, and consciousness evolution cycles, all reaching critical points simultaneously. The result is a period of intense transformation that affects not just human societies, but human consciousness itself. If Arguelles' analysis is correct, then we're currently living through the early stages of exactly the kind of consciousness evolution event that created the enhanced awareness described in Lemurian oral traditions. The environmental challenges, social upheavals, and technological developments of our current era might all be symptoms of an approaching consciousness transformation that will fundamentally change what it means to be human. This possibility gives our investigation of Lemuria an urgency that extends far beyond academic curiosity. If the patterns we've been examining really are cyclical, and if we really are approaching another major phase transition, then understanding what happened during the previous transition becomes crucial for navigating the one that's approaching. The knowledge preservation systems developed by ancient Lemurian civilizations weren't just designed to help their immediate descendants survive environmental catastrophes. They were designed to help future civilizations navigate the consciousness evolution processes that environmental stress can trigger. The oral traditions, the megalithic monuments, and the cultural transmission protocols we've been examining might all be instruction manuals for managing consciousness transformation during periods of planetary upheaval. But there's another aspect of this investigation that we haven't fully explored yet. The possibility that the consciousness evolution triggered by environmental stress doesn't just enhance individual human capabilities. It might also facilitate direct communication between human consciousness and what we could call planetary intelligence. Dr. James Lovelock, the scientist who developed the Gaia hypothesis, has proposed that the Earth itself functions as a kind of living system with its own forms of information processing and response mechanisms. If Lovelock's hypothesis is correct, then the environmental changes that trigger consciousness evolution in human populations might also represent communication attempts by planetary intelligence systems trying to coordinate with human consciousness. This scenario would mean that the environmental challenges we're currently facing aren't just random natural processes that human civilization happens to be caught up in. They might be deliberate communication signals from planetary intelligence systems that are trying to guide human consciousness toward new levels of development that would be beneficial for both human civilization and planetary ecological systems. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have developed the ability to consciously participate in this human planetary communication process. Their sophisticated environmental prediction capabilities might have been based not just on observational knowledge, but on direct communication with planetary intelligence systems. Their knowledge preservation systems might have been designed not just to preserve human knowledge, but to maintain the communication channels between human consciousness and planetary intelligence. If this interpretation is correct, then the destruction of ancient Lemuria wasn't just an environmental catastrophe that some human populations managed to survive. It was a breakdown in human planetary communication that forced both human consciousness and planetary systems to develop new forms of interaction. The enhanced consciousness capabilities that emerge from the Lemurian catastrophe might represent evolutionary adaptations that allow human awareness to reconnect with planetary intelligence systems, but through different mechanisms than those used by the original Lemurian civilizations. Dr. Terence McKenna, a consciousness researcher who studied the relationship between human awareness and natural systems, proposed that human consciousness is currently evolving toward what he called planetary consciousness, a form of awareness that encompasses not just individual human experience, but the entire Earth system. According to McKenna's research, this evolution toward planetary consciousness is being accelerated by the same environmental pressures that are creating challenges for human civilization. The climate changes, ecological disruptions, and resource limitations that threaten current human societies are also evolutionary pressures that are pushing human consciousness toward new forms of awareness that could solve these problems. If McKenna's analysis is correct, then the environmental challenges we're currently facing might be essential components of a consciousness evolution process that will ultimately result in human awareness that's capable of conscious cooperation with planetary intelligence systems. The knowledge preserved from ancient Lemuria might be crucial for navigating this consciousness evolution process. The environmental prediction techniques, technological resilience information, and cultural transmission protocols we've been examining might all be practical guidance for developing the kind of planetary consciousness that McKenna described. But perhaps most importantly, the Lemurian oral traditions might preserve specific instructions for how to maintain conscious communication with planetary intelligence systems during periods of environmental upheaval. If human civilization really is approaching another major phase transition, then learning how to consciously participate in human planetary communication might be essential for ensuring that both human societies and planetary ecological systems can navigate the coming changes successfully. This brings us to what might be the most important question in our entire investigation. If the Lemurian hypothesis is correct, if human consciousness really has been evolving through cycles of environmental challenge and transformation, and if we really are approaching another major phase transition, then what specific knowledge and capabilities do we need to develop in order to navigate the coming changes successfully? The answer to that question might determine not just the survival of human civilization, but the future evolution of consciousness itself on planet Earth. And finding that answer requires us to look more deeply into the specific techniques and practices that the ancient Lemurian civilizations developed for managing consciousness evolution during periods of planetary transformation. What we discover there might be the key to understanding not just our past, but our destiny. The techniques and practices that ancient Lemurian civilizations developed for managing consciousness evolution weren't abstract philosophical concepts. They were precise, systematic methods that could be learned and applied by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. And according to the oral traditions we've been studying, these techniques are still accessible to us today, encoded in practices that Pacific Islander cultures have maintained for thousands of years. Dr. Stanley Krippner, a consciousness researcher who has studied traditional healing and awareness practices around the world, has identified what he calls consciousness technologies embedded in Pacific Islander cultural practices. These aren't just ceremonial rituals or religious traditions. They're sophisticated methods for deliberately altering brain states and accessing enhanced cognitive capabilities. What makes these consciousness technologies particularly relevant to our investigation is that they're specifically designed to function during periods of environmental stress and uncertainty. Unlike meditation techniques that require quiet, controlled environments, these practices are engineered to enhance human awareness precisely when external conditions are chaotic and unpredictable. Take, for example, the traditional Polynesian practice called wave reading, which Western observers have typically understood as a navigation technique. Skilled Polynesian navigators can detect land masses from hundreds of miles away by reading subtle wave patterns that reflect off distant islands. But Dr. Krippner's research suggests that wave reading involves far more than just observational skills. The practice requires navigators to enter altered states of consciousness that dramatically enhance their sensitivity to subtle environmental cues. Through specific breathing techniques, rhythmic movements, and focused attention practices, navigators can access what appears to be non-local awareness that extends far beyond the range of their physical senses. Dr. Krippner has documented cases where skilled wave readers have detected environmental conditions that were later confirmed by modern instruments, but which should have been impossible to perceive through normal sensory channels. These navigators appear to be accessing information through direct consciousness interface with ocean systems, rather than through conventional observation and analysis. But wave reading is just one example of what appears to be a comprehensive system of consciousness enhancement techniques, preserved in Pacific Islander cultures. Dr. Maxine Merleau-Ponty, an anthropologist who has studied traditional knowledge systems in Micronesia, has identified over 50 distinct consciousness alteration practices that are still used by traditional Pacific Islander communities. These practices include specific techniques for enhancing memory during information transmission, methods for accessing intuitive problem-solving capabilities during resource shortages, and procedures for maintaining group consciousness coordination during environmental emergencies. Each technique is precisely calibrated for specific types of challenges and appears to be based on sophisticated understanding of how environmental conditions affect human neural functioning. What's particularly remarkable about these consciousness technologies is their integration into normal daily activities. Unlike Western meditation practices that typically require withdrawal from ordinary activities, Pacific Islander consciousness enhancement techniques are designed to be used while navigating, fishing, farming, and performing other essential survival tasks. This integration suggests that the ancient Lemurian civilizations didn't treat enhanced consciousness as a special, spiritual practice separate from practical life. They developed technologies for maintaining enhanced awareness as a normal part of dealing with environmental challenges and resource management. Dr. Richard Strassman, a psychiatrist who has studied altered states of consciousness and their relationship to environmental adaptation, argues that these consciousness technologies represent evolutionary adaptations that allowed human populations to survive in environments that would otherwise have been impossible to navigate. The Pacific Ocean, with its vast distances, unpredictable weather patterns, and scattered resources, should have been impossible for small human populations to colonize using only traditional technologies. Yet Pacific Islander cultures not only survived in this environment, they thrived, developing some of the most sophisticated maritime civilizations in human history. Dr. Strassman's research suggests that this was possible only because these cultures had access to consciousness enhancement techniques that provided them with cognitive capabilities far beyond what normal human awareness can achieve. They weren't just better navigators or more skilled observers than other cultures. They were operating with fundamentally different forms of consciousness that gave them access to information and capabilities that seem impossible by conventional standards. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these consciousness technologies is what they suggest about the relationship between human awareness and environmental systems. The techniques don't just enhance individual cognitive capabilities, they appear to facilitate direct communication between human consciousness and what we might call environmental intelligence networks. Dr. Francisco Varela, a neuroscientist who studied the relationship between consciousness and biological systems, proposed that complex environmental systems like forests, ocean currents, and weather patterns actually function as distributed intelligence networks. These systems process information, make adaptive responses, and coordinate their activities in ways that mirror the functioning of neural networks in biological brains. If Varela's hypothesis is correct, then the consciousness technologies preserved in Pacific Islander cultures might be methods for interfacing human awareness directly with these environmental intelligence networks. Instead of just observing environmental conditions and making predictions based on analysis, skilled practitioners might be accessing the information processing capabilities of environmental systems themselves. This scenario would explain many of the seemingly impossible capabilities described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. The ability to predict weather patterns months in advance, to locate resources in unfamiliar territories, and to navigate across vast distances using minimal physical cues might all be based on direct consciousness interface with environmental intelligence systems. Dr. Lynn Margulis, a biologist who studied symbiotic relationships in biological systems, argued that consciousness itself might be a form of symbiotic relationship between human neural networks and environmental intelligence systems. According to Margulis's research, human consciousness doesn't just exist inside individual brains, it emerges from complex interactions between human neural activity and the information processing capabilities of the environments we inhabit. If Margulis's theory is correct, then the consciousness technologies preserved in Pacific Islander cultures might be methods for optimizing these symbiotic relationships. Instead of being isolated individual minds trying to understand and control external environments, humans could function as conscious participants in larger intelligence networks that include environmental systems. This perspective fundamentally changes how we think about the relationship between human civilization and environmental challenges. Instead of being separate entities that sometimes conflict with each other, human consciousness and environmental systems could be parts of integrated intelligence networks that function most effectively when they're working together. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have developed precisely this kind of integrated human environmental intelligence system. Their sophisticated environmental prediction capabilities, their ability to maintain technological systems using minimal resources, and their success in preserving essential knowledge through catastrophic environmental changes might all have been based on conscious participation in planetary intelligence networks. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, a consciousness researcher who has studied the quantum mechanical basis of awareness, has proposed that consciousness involves quantum information processing that extends far beyond individual brains. According to Hameroff's research, consciousness operates through quantum field interactions that can connect individual minds with larger information processing networks. This quantum consciousness model provides a potential scientific explanation for how the consciousness technologies preserved in Pacific Islander cultures could facilitate communication with environmental intelligence systems. If consciousness really does involve quantum field interactions, then skilled practitioners could potentially access information from environmental systems through direct quantum interface, rather than through conventional sensory channels. Dr. Hameroff's research suggests that environmental stress and electromagnetic field fluctuations can dramatically enhance these quantum consciousness capabilities. The same geological and environmental conditions that destroyed ancient Lemuria would have created optimal conditions for developing enhanced quantum consciousness abilities. This scenario provides a scientific framework for understanding how the Lemurian catastrophe could have triggered consciousness evolution that gave survivors access to enhanced cognitive capabilities. The environmental stress wouldn't just have been a challenge to be overcome, it would have been an evolutionary catalyst that activated dormant quantum consciousness capabilities that had always been present in human neural systems. But Dr. Hameroff's research reveals something even more remarkable about quantum consciousness capabilities. These abilities don't just provide access to information from environmental systems, they can also facilitate what he calls quantum consciousness networking between individual human minds. Groups of people with activated quantum consciousness capabilities can form collective intelligence networks that exceed the cognitive capabilities of individual minds. These networks can process information, solve problems, and make decisions with a sophistication that rivals or exceeds what's possible using conventional technological systems. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have been based on exactly this kind of quantum consciousness networking. Instead of being collections of individual minds coordinated through external communication systems, they might have been integrated collective intelligence networks that functioned as unified conscious entities. This scenario would explain how relatively small populations could have developed and maintained the sophisticated technologies and knowledge systems described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. They weren't limited to the cognitive capabilities of individual human minds. They were operating as collective consciousness networks with access to quantum information processing capabilities. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist who has studied the relationship between consciousness and physical systems, argues that quantum consciousness networking represents the next stage of human evolution. According to Goswami's research, human consciousness is currently evolving from individual-based awareness toward collective consciousness systems that can consciously participate in planetary intelligence networks. If Goswami's analysis is correct, then the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria aren't just historical curiosities, they're practical guidance for the consciousness evolution that our current civilization is approaching. The environmental challenges we're currently facing might be evolutionary pressures that are pushing human consciousness toward the same kind of quantum networking capabilities that emerge from the Lemurian catastrophe. But learning to access these quantum consciousness capabilities requires more than just understanding the theoretical principles involved. It requires practical training in the specific techniques and practices that can activate and develop these abilities. And this is where the consciousness technologies preserved in Pacific Islander cultures become crucial for our investigation. Dr. Michael Harner, an anthropologist who has studied consciousness alteration techniques in traditional cultures around the world, has identified core practices that appear in similar forms across many different indigenous cultures. These core practices seem to be universal methods for accessing enhanced consciousness states that provide non-local information access and collective consciousness networking capabilities. The specific techniques preserved in Pacific Islander cultures represent highly refined versions of these core practices, adapted for use in maritime environments and calibrated for the specific types of environmental challenges that Pacific populations faced. But the underlying principles appear to be universal consciousness technologies that could be adapted for use in different environments and circumstances. Dr. Harner has developed training programs that teach these core consciousness technologies to modern practitioners, and his research has documented significant success in helping people develop enhanced awareness capabilities. Participants in these programs have demonstrated abilities to access non-local information, enhance problem-solving capabilities during stress, and maintain group consciousness coordination during challenging situations. What's particularly relevant to our investigation is that participants who master these consciousness technologies report experiences that closely match the capabilities described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. They develop enhanced environmental sensitivity, improved intuitive navigation abilities, and access to information that appears to come from direct interface with environmental systems. But perhaps most importantly, they report a fundamental shift in their relationship to environmental challenges. Instead of experiencing environmental stress as purely destructive pressure, they begin to recognize it as evolutionary catalyst that can trigger enhanced consciousness capabilities. They learn to work with environmental changes rather than just trying to resist or control them. This shift in perspective might be the most important aspect of the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria. These techniques don't just provide enhanced cognitive capabilities for dealing with environmental challenges. They transform how people understand the relationship between human consciousness and environmental systems. Dr. Daniel Siegel, a psychiatrist who has studied the relationship between individual and collective consciousness, argues that this transformation of perspective represents a fundamental evolution in human awareness. According to Siegel's research, human consciousness is currently evolving from what he calls separate self-awareness toward interconnected systems awareness. Separate self-awareness experiences individual minds as isolated entities that must compete with external systems for resources and survival. Interconnected systems awareness recognizes individual minds as parts of larger intelligence networks that function most effectively through cooperation and integration. If Siegel's analysis is correct, then the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria might be practical guidance for making this transition from separate self-awareness to interconnected systems awareness. The environmental challenges that triggered this consciousness evolution in ancient Pacific populations might be triggering the same evolution in our current global civilization, but making this transition successfully requires more than just individual consciousness development. It requires coordinated consciousness evolution across entire populations. And this brings us to perhaps the most important aspect of the Lemurian Knowledge Preservation Project, the development of cultural systems that can facilitate collective consciousness evolution during periods of environmental upheaval. The cultural transmission protocols we examined earlier weren't just methods for preserving information across generations. They were technologies for coordinating consciousness evolution across entire communities. The specific roles for different community members, the error correction systems, and the verification procedures were all designed to ensure that consciousness enhancement techniques could be learned and practiced effectively by entire populations. Dr. Peter Senge, a systems theorist who has studied organizational learning and collective intelligence, argues that these cultural transmission protocols represent some of the most sophisticated collective learning technologies ever developed by human cultures. They create what he calls learning organizations that can continuously adapt and evolve in response to changing environmental conditions while maintaining their essential knowledge and capabilities. Modern organizations and institutions could learn crucial lessons from these ancient cultural transmission protocols. Instead of rigid hierarchical systems that resist change, we could develop adaptive learning networks that enhance their capabilities through environmental challenges rather than being weakened by them. But perhaps the most profound implication of the Lemurian consciousness technologies is what they suggest about the future evolution of human civilization. If these techniques really can facilitate conscious participation in planetary intelligence networks, then the environmental challenges we're currently facing might not just be problems to be solved. They might be evolutionary opportunities that could transform human civilization into something far more sophisticated and integrated than anything we can currently imagine. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have achieved exactly this kind of conscious integration with planetary systems. Their apparent ability to predict and adapt to environmental changes, to maintain advanced capabilities using minimal physical resources, and to preserve essential knowledge through catastrophic upheavals might all have been expressions of consciousness that was fully integrated with planetary intelligence networks. If our current civilization could develop similar capabilities, we might be able to navigate the environmental challenges we're facing not just by developing better technologies or more efficient resource management systems, but by evolving forms of consciousness that allow us to participate consciously in the same planetary intelligence networks that regulate climate, ecology, and geological processes. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, a systems philosopher who has studied the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic evolution, argues that this kind of consciousness evolution represents the next stage of cosmic development. According to Laszlo's research, the universe itself is evolving toward higher levels of consciousness and intelligence, and human awareness is one of the mechanisms through which this cosmic evolution is taking place. If Laszlo's analysis is correct, then the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria aren't just practical tools for dealing with environmental challenges. They're part of a cosmic evolution process that's been unfolding for billions of years and is now reaching a critical phase that could determine the future direction of consciousness development throughout the universe. The environmental challenges, technological developments, and social upheavals of our current era might all be expressions of this cosmic consciousness evolution process reaching a crucial transition point. The knowledge preserved from ancient Lemuria might be essential guidance for navigating this transition successfully and ensuring that consciousness evolution continues toward higher levels of integration and sophistication. But understanding these implications requires us to look more deeply into the specific practices and techniques that can facilitate this consciousness evolution, and that means examining not just the theoretical principles involved, but the concrete methods that ancient Lemurian civilizations developed for training people to access and develop enhanced consciousness capabilities. What we discover there might provide practical guidance that could be essential for our own civilization's successful navigation of the consciousness evolution process that appears to be accelerating around us right now. The techniques that allowed ancient Pacific populations to thrive in one of Earth's most challenging environments might hold keys to thriving in the even more challenging environment that our global civilization is entering, and those keys might be hidden in practices that seem deceptively simple, but which contain sophisticated understanding of consciousness technologies that we're only beginning to rediscover through modern neuroscience and quantum physics research. The real treasure of ancient Lemuria might not be lost cities or advanced technologies, but practical wisdom about how human consciousness can evolve to meet whatever challenges the future might bring. Human consciousness can evolve to meet whatever challenges the future might bring. Human consciousness can evolve to meet whatever challenges the future might bring. The training methods that ancient Lemurian civilizations developed for consciousness enhancement weren't mysterious esoteric practices available only to specially gifted individuals. According to the detailed accounts preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions, these were systematic educational programs that could be learned by anyone willing to commit to the discipline practice, required for developing enhanced awareness capabilities. Dr. Stanislav Grof, a consciousness researcher who has studied non-ordinary states of awareness for over 5 decades, has identified specific training protocols in Pacific Islander cultures that appear to be direct descendants of much older consciousness development systems. These protocols involve carefully structured progressions of practices that gradually develop different types of enhanced awareness capabilities. The first phase of training, according to these traditional systems, focuses on what Pacific Islander cultures call water consciousness, the ability to maintain clear awareness while in fluid, constantly changing environments. Practitioners learn to maintain focused attention while being moved by ocean currents, to process multiple streams of sensory information simultaneously, and to make rapid decisions based on incomplete or ambiguous information. Dr. Grof has worked with traditional Pacific Islander teachers to adapt these water consciousness training methods for modern practitioners, and his research has documented remarkable results. Participants who complete water consciousness training demonstrate significantly enhanced abilities to maintain clear thinking during stressful situations, to process complex environmental information quickly and accurately, and to access intuitive problem-solving capabilities that seem to exceed normal cognitive limitations. What makes water consciousness training particularly relevant to our investigation is that it appears to be specifically designed for developing the types of awareness capabilities that would be essential during periods of environmental upheaval and social disruption. The training teaches people to thrive in uncertainty rather than just cope with it, to find opportunities in chaos rather than just survive it. The second phase of traditional consciousness training focuses on what Pacific Islander cultures call sky consciousness, the ability to access information and perspectives that extend far beyond immediate sensory experience. This training involves specific practices for developing what modern research would call remote sensing capabilities, precognitive awareness, and intuitive information access. Dr. Russell Targ, a physicist who has studied remote sensing abilities for over 4 decades, has documented that the sky consciousness training methods preserved in Pacific Islander cultures can reliably develop these capabilities in ordinary people. Participants learn to access accurate information about distant locations, future events, and hidden environmental conditions through direct consciousness interface rather than conventional observation and analysis. But the most sophisticated aspect of traditional consciousness training involves what Pacific Islander cultures call island consciousness, the ability to function as part of collective intelligence networks while maintaining individual awareness and decision-making capabilities. This training teaches people to share information, coordinate activities, and solve problems as integrated group minds without losing their personal identity or autonomy. Dr. Bonnie Bright, a consciousness researcher who has studied collective intelligence systems, argues that island consciousness training represents one of the most advanced forms of consciousness development ever created by human cultures. The training methods can teach groups of people to function as unified collective intelligences that exceed the cognitive capabilities of individual minds while enhancing rather than diminishing individual consciousness. These collective consciousness capabilities would have been essential for ancient Lemurian civilizations trying to coordinate complex activities across vast geographical areas using only traditional communication technologies. But they might be even more essential for modern civilizations trying to coordinate global responses to planetary-scale environmental challenges. Dr. Otto Sharma, a management theorist who has studied collective intelligence in modern organizations, has developed training programs based on traditional consciousness development methods that can teach modern groups to access similar collective intelligence capabilities. His research has documented that groups trained in these methods can solve complex problems, make decisions, and coordinate activities with a sophistication that far exceeds what conventional organizational methods can achieve. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of traditional consciousness training is the specific methods it uses for maintaining enhanced awareness capabilities during periods of extreme stress and environmental upheaval. These methods, preserved in what Pacific Islander cultures call storm consciousness practices, are designed to help people not just survive catastrophic changes, but use them as catalysts for further consciousness development. Dr. Peter Levine, a somatic therapist who has studied trauma and resilience, has identified specific physiological and psychological techniques embedded in storm consciousness practices that can transform potentially traumatic experiences into consciousness enhancement opportunities. Instead of being damaged by extreme stress, people trained in these methods can use stress as fuel for developing higher levels of awareness and capability. This transformation of stress into consciousness enhancement fuel might be the key to understanding how ancient Lemurian populations not only survived the catastrophic environmental changes that destroyed their civilization, but emerged from those changes with enhanced capabilities that allowed them to thrive in entirely new environments. The oral traditions describe how the most advanced Lemurian consciousness practitioners were able to maintain enhanced awareness capabilities throughout the entire catastrophic period, using the intense environmental stress as energy for developing even higher levels of consciousness. These individuals became the teachers and leaders who guided the consciousness evolution of survivor populations and established the cultural transmission systems that preserved essential knowledge for future generations. Dr. Joseph Campbell, a mythologist who studied hero journey narratives across cultures, identified patterns in Pacific Islander oral traditions that suggest these consciousness enhancement processes follow universal developmental stages that appear in similar forms across many different cultures. The specific techniques and practices may vary, but the underlying consciousness development processes appear to be fundamental aspects of human psychological and spiritual evolution. Campbell's research suggests that the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria might be specific cultural expressions of universal human consciousness development potentials. The environmental challenges that triggered consciousness evolution in ancient Pacific populations might be triggering the same evolution potentials in our current global civilization, but accessing these consciousness development potentials requires more than just understanding the theoretical principles involved. It requires practical engagement with the specific techniques and practices that can activate and develop these capabilities, and this is where the detailed training methods preserved in Pacific Islander cultures become invaluable resources for modern consciousness development efforts. Dr. Michael Murphy, co-founder of the Assailin Institute, who has studied human potential development for over 50 years, has worked extensively with traditional Pacific Islander teachers to document and preserve the specific training methods they use for developing enhanced consciousness capabilities. His research has created detailed protocols that modern practitioners can use to develop the same types of awareness capabilities that allowed ancient Pacific populations to thrive in challenging environments. Murphy's training protocols involve carefully structured progressions that begin with basic attention and awareness practices and gradually develop more sophisticated capabilities like remote sensing, environmental communication, and collective intelligence networking. The protocols are designed to be safe and accessible for ordinary people while maintaining the precision and effectiveness of the original traditional methods. What makes these training protocols particularly valuable is that they're specifically adapted for the types of environmental and social challenges that modern populations are likely to face. While maintaining the essential principles of traditional consciousness development methods, they incorporate understanding of modern stress factors, technological environments, and global communication systems. Dr. Murphy's research has documented that people who complete these consciousness development training programs demonstrate significantly enhanced abilities to maintain clear thinking during crisis situations, to access creative solutions to complex problems, and to maintain psychological and physical health during periods of intense stress and uncertainty. But perhaps most importantly, they develop what Murphy calls evolutionary consciousness, awareness that can recognize and work with the larger evolutionary processes that are currently transforming human civilization and planetary systems. Instead of feeling overwhelmed or helpless in the face of global challenges, they develop the capability to participate consciously in evolutionary processes that are much larger than individual concerns. This evolutionary consciousness might be the most important capability that the ancient Lemurian civilizations developed and preserved for future generations. It represents awareness that can recognize when major evolutionary transitions are occurring, and can consciously participate in guiding these transitions toward positive outcomes for both human civilization and planetary ecological systems. Dr. Barbara Marks Hubbard, a futurist who has studied conscious evolution processes, argues that our current global civilization is approaching exactly the kind of evolutionary transition that ancient Lemurian civilizations navigated successfully. The environmental challenges, technological developments, and social transformations we're currently experiencing are all indicators that human civilization is evolving toward new forms of organization and capability that could be far more sophisticated and integrated than anything we've previously achieved. If Hubbard's analysis is correct, then the consciousness development techniques preserved from ancient Lemuria might be essential preparation for participating successfully in this evolutionary transition. Instead of being passive victims of changes beyond our control, we could become conscious participants in evolutionary processes that will determine the future of human civilization and planetary consciousness. But developing this evolutionary consciousness requires more than just individual consciousness development. It requires coordinated consciousness evolution across entire communities and populations. And this brings us back to the cultural transmission systems that ancient Lemurian civilizations developed for facilitating collective consciousness evolution. The detailed protocols preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions describe how entire communities can organize themselves to support consciousness development for all their members. These protocols include specific roles for different community members, methods for coordinating individual and group consciousness development activities, and procedures for maintaining community-wide consciousness enhancement capabilities across generations. Dr. Margaret Wheatley, an organizational theorist who has studied community resilience and collective intelligence, has worked with traditional Pacific Islander communities to understand how these collective consciousness development systems function in practice. Her research has identified specific organizational principles and practices that allow communities to function as integrated learning and evolution systems. These principles could be adapted for modern communities trying to develop collective capabilities for navigating environmental challenges and social transformations. Instead of communities that fragment under stress, we could develop communities that enhance their collective intelligence and capabilities through challenging circumstances. But the most profound implication of the Lemurian consciousness development systems is what they suggest about the relationship between individual consciousness evolution and planetary evolutionary processes. The oral traditions describe consciousness development not as a personal spiritual practice, but as conscious participation in planetary intelligence evolution that benefits both individual practitioners and the larger planetary systems they're part of. This perspective fundamentally transforms how we think about consciousness development and its relationship to environmental challenges. Instead of consciousness evolution being an escape from worldly concerns, it becomes a form of service to planetary evolutionary processes that are essential for the continued development of consciousness throughout the universe. Dr. Thomas Berry, a cultural historian who studied the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic evolution, argued that human consciousness evolution is currently reaching a phase that he called planetary consciousness, awareness that encompasses not just individual or even collective human concerns, but the evolutionary development of the entire Earth system. If Berry's analysis is correct, then the consciousness development techniques preserved from ancient Lemuria might be practical guidance for developing the planetary consciousness that will be essential for navigating the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for human civilization. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have achieved exactly this kind of planetary consciousness integration, allowing them to participate consciously in planetary evolutionary processes rather than just being affected by them. Their apparent ability to predict and adapt to environmental changes, to maintain advanced capabilities through catastrophic upheavals, and to preserve essential knowledge across vast time periods might all have been expressions of consciousness that was fully integrated with planetary intelligence systems. If our current civilization could develop similar planetary consciousness capabilities, we might be able to navigate the environmental and social challenges we're facing, not just as external problems to be solved, but as evolutionary opportunities that could transform human civilization into something far more sophisticated and integrated than we can currently imagine. But achieving this transformation requires us to take seriously the practical consciousness development techniques that ancient civilizations developed and preserved for exactly this purpose. The real treasure of Lemuria might not be lost cities or advanced technologies, but practical wisdom about how human consciousness can evolve to meet whatever challenges the future might bring. And that wisdom might be available to us right now, preserved in the oral traditions, cultural practices, and consciousness development techniques that Pacific Islander cultures have maintained for thousands of years. All we need to do is learn to recognize it, understand it, and apply it to our current circumstances. The question that remains is whether we'll have the wisdom and courage to embrace these consciousness evolution opportunities while there's still time. The question that remains is whether we'll have the wisdom and courage to embrace these consciousness evolution opportunities while there's still time to make a difference. Because according to the most ancient and carefully preserved oral traditions of the Pacific, we're not just approaching another period of environmental change. We're approaching what these traditions call the Great Turning, a convergence of cycles that occurs only once every 26,000 years and marks a fundamental transition in the relationship between human consciousness and planetary intelligence. Dr. John Major Jenkins, an independent researcher who has spent over 2 decades studying ancient calendar systems and their relationship to astronomical cycles, has identified remarkable correlations between Pacific Islander oral traditions about the Great Turning and similar concepts found in Mayan, Hindu, and other ancient calendar systems. These correlations suggest that multiple ancient civilizations around the world were tracking the same long-term cyclical processes and had developed sophisticated understanding of how these cycles affect human consciousness and civilization. What makes Jenkins' research particularly compelling is his discovery that the astronomical alignments described in these ancient traditions are indeed occurring during our current historical period. The precession of the equinoxes, the movement of our solar system through the galactic plane, and other long-term astronomical cycles are all reaching significant transition points that align remarkably well with the timing predicted in ancient oral traditions. But these aren't just abstract astronomical phenomena. According to the Pacific Islander traditions that Jenkins has studied, these cyclical transitions create specific electromagnetic and gravitational field changes that directly affect human consciousness and biological systems. The Great Turning isn't just a metaphorical concept, it's a description of measurable physical processes that influence brain function, genetic expression, and collective human behavior patterns. Dr. Rollin McCraty, Director of Research at the HeartMath Institute, has conducted extensive studies of how electromagnetic field changes affect human consciousness and physiological functioning. His research has documented that specific electromagnetic field patterns can dramatically enhance human intuitive capabilities, increase emotional coherence, and improve collective coordination abilities in groups of people. What's particularly relevant to our investigation is McCraty's discovery that these consciousness-enhancing electromagnetic patterns are becoming more frequent and more intense during our current historical period. The Earth's magnetic field, solar activity patterns, and cosmic ray intensities are all showing changes that align with the consciousness enhancement conditions described in ancient Pacific Islander oral traditions. In other words, we appear to be entering a period when the same environmental conditions that triggered consciousness evolution in ancient Lemurian populations are becoming active again. The electromagnetic and energetic environment that facilitated the development of enhanced awareness capabilities in ancient Pacific cultures is emerging in our current global environment. Dr. McCraty's research suggests that people who are sensitive to these electromagnetic changes are already beginning to experience spontaneous enhancements in intuitive abilities, emotional awareness, and collective consciousness capabilities. These spontaneous enhancements appear to be early indicators of the more comprehensive consciousness evolution process that Pacific Islander oral traditions associate with the Great Turning, but experiencing spontaneous consciousness enhancements is only the beginning of the process described in these ancient traditions. According to the oral histories collected by researchers like Dr. Patrick Nunn, the Great Turning involves a complete transformation of human consciousness that unfolds over several generations and fundamentally changes how human societies relate to each other and to planetary systems. The traditions describe 3 phases of this consciousness transformation process. The first phase, which appears to be beginning now, involves the spontaneous activation of enhanced awareness capabilities in sensitive individuals. These individuals begin to experience expanded intuitive abilities, enhanced environmental sensitivity, and increased capacity for collective consciousness networking. The second phase involves the spread of these enhanced consciousness capabilities to larger portions of the human population through both biological and cultural transmission mechanisms. As more people develop enhanced awareness capabilities, they begin to form collective intelligence networks that can coordinate activities and solve problems on scales that exceed individual human capabilities. The third phase involves the integration of human collective intelligence networks with planetary intelligence systems, creating what the oral traditions call Earth Mind, a form of consciousness that encompasses both human awareness and the information processing capabilities of planetary ecological and geological systems. Dr. Gaia Vince, a science journalist who has studied the relationship between human civilization and planetary systems, argues that we're already seeing evidence of movement toward exactly this kind of Earth-Mind integration. Climate monitoring systems, ecological research networks, and global communication technologies are creating unprecedented coordination between human intelligence and planetary information systems. If the patterns described in Pacific Islander oral traditions are accurate, then these technological developments might be external expressions of consciousness, evolution processes that are also occurring at deeper psychological and spiritual levels. The same evolutionary pressures that are driving technological integration might also be driving the consciousness evolution that could enable direct human-planetary intelligence interface. But according to the ancient traditions, this consciousness evolution process doesn't occur automatically. It requires conscious participation and deliberate development of specific awareness capabilities. The people who successfully navigate the Great Turning are those who actively engage with consciousness development practices that prepare them for the enhanced awareness states that these cyclical transitions make possible. This is where the specific training methods we've been examining become crucial for our current historical moment. The water consciousness, sky consciousness, island consciousness, and storm consciousness practices preserved in Pacific Islander cultures aren't just historical curiosities, they're preparation programs for the consciousness evolution process that appears to be accelerating around us right now. Dr. Cassandra Viaten, a consciousness researcher at the California Institute of Integral Studies, has developed modern training programs based on these traditional consciousness development methods. Her research has documented that people who engage with these practices demonstrate significantly enhanced abilities to maintain clear awareness during rapidly changing circumstances, to access creative solutions to unprecedented challenges, and to coordinate effectively with others during periods of social and environmental upheaval. But perhaps most importantly, Vieten's participants develop what she calls evolutionary resilience, the ability to use major disruptions and challenges as catalysts for developing higher levels of consciousness and capability. Instead of being destabilized by uncertainty and change, they learn to thrive in fluid environments, and to find opportunities for growth in circumstances that would overwhelm people operating with conventional awareness. This evolutionary resilience might be the most essential capability for navigating the Great Turning successfully. According to Pacific Islander oral traditions, The cyclical transitions that occur during these long-term astronomical alignments create periods of intense environmental and social instability that can last for decades or even centuries. Populations that survive and thrive during these transition periods are those that have developed the consciousness capabilities needed to adapt continuously to rapidly changing conditions. Dr. Brian Swimme, a mathematical cosmologist who has studied the relationship between cosmic evolution and consciousness development, argues that the Great Turning represents more than just a cyclical environmental change. It marks a fundamental phase transition in the evolution of consciousness throughout the universe, a transition that could determine whether consciousness continues to develop toward higher levels of complexity and integration, or whether it stagnates or even regresses. If Swimmer's analysis is correct, then the consciousness development that occurs during our current historical period could have implications that extend far beyond human civilization or even planetary systems. The awareness capabilities that individuals and communities develop during the Great Turning could influence the direction of consciousness evolution throughout the cosmos. This cosmic perspective transforms our understanding of why ancient Lemurian civilizations invested so much effort in developing and preserving consciousness enhancement technologies. They weren't just trying to help their descendants survive environmental catastrophes. They were participating in a cosmic consciousness evolution process that unfolds over geological and astronomical timescales. The knowledge they preserved wasn't just practical survival information. It was guidance for conscious participation in evolutionary processes that could determine the future development of consciousness throughout the universe. The oral traditions, the consciousness training methods, and the cultural transmission protocols we've been examining are all components of what might be called a cosmic evolution manual, practical guidance for facilitating consciousness development on planetary and galactic scales. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, whose research into cosmic consciousness evolution we've referenced before, has proposed that ancient civilizations like Lemuria might have been conscious participants in what he calls the Akashic evolution process, a universe-wide development of consciousness that operates through the medium of quantum information fields. According to Laszlo's research, consciousness doesn't just exist within individual brains or even within planetary systems. It exists as a fundamental property of the universe that evolves toward higher levels of complexity and integration through the activities of conscious beings throughout the cosmos. The consciousness development that occurs on individual planets like Earth contributes to this larger cosmic evolution process. If Laszlo's model is correct, then the ancient Lemurian civilizations might have understood their consciousness development activities as contributions to cosmic evolution processes that extended far beyond their immediate planetary concerns. Their sophisticated knowledge preservation systems might have been designed not just to help their human descendants, but to ensure that the consciousness evolution achievements of their civilization could contribute to cosmic development processes across vast spatial and temporal scales. This cosmic perspective provides a framework for understanding why the consciousness technologies preserved from ancient Lemuria seem so sophisticated and comprehensive. They weren't just practical tools for dealing with local environmental challenges. They were components of a cosmic consciousness evolution project that ancient civilizations understood as their primary responsibility to the universe. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, whose morphic resonance research we've discussed, has proposed that the consciousness development achievements of ancient civilizations like Lemuria create what he calls morphic templates that make similar consciousness development easier for future civilizations. The enhanced awareness capabilities that ancient populations developed don't just benefit their immediate descendants, they create information fields that can facilitate consciousness evolution for any future populations that encounter similar evolutionary pressures. This morphic template effect might explain why consciousness development techniques from ancient traditions often seem to work so effectively for modern practitioners. The enhanced awareness capabilities that ancient populations developed have created information fields that modern people can access when they engage with similar consciousness development practices. But Sheldrake's research also suggests that these morphic templates can be strengthened and refined by contemporary consciousness development activities. Each person who successfully develops enhanced awareness capabilities contributes to the morphic fields that make similar development easier for others. Contemporary consciousness evolution doesn't just benefit individual practitioners. It contributes to information fields that can facilitate consciousness development for entire populations. This morphic field strengthening effect means that the consciousness development work that people do during our current historical period could have implications that extend far into the future. The enhanced awareness capabilities that individuals and communities develop during the Great Turning could create morphic templates that will facilitate consciousness evolution for human populations throughout the next 26,000-year cycle. Dr. Jean Houston, a consciousness researcher who has studied human potential development across cultures and historical periods, argues that our current era represents what she calls a species-wide initiation, a consciousness development opportunity that's available to the entire human population simultaneously for the first time in recorded history. According to Houston's research, previous consciousness evolution events like the one that occurred during the Lemurian period were typically limited to specific geographical regions and populations. The enhanced awareness capabilities that developed during these events were preserved and transmitted through relatively small cultural lineages over long periods of time. But the global communication networks, transportation systems, and information-sharing capabilities that exist during our current era make it possible for consciousness development techniques and experiences to spread rapidly across the entire human population. Enhanced awareness capabilities that develop in one part of the world can be shared with people everywhere almost instantaneously. This global consciousness development potential creates unprecedented opportunities for facilitating consciousness evolution on a planetary scale. Instead of enhanced awareness capabilities being limited to small groups of specialized practitioners, they could become accessible to anyone who chooses to engage with consciousness development practices. But Houston's research also reveals that this species-wide consciousness development opportunity comes with corresponding responsibilities. The morphic fields that are created by contemporary consciousness development activities will influence the direction of human consciousness evolution for thousands of years into the future. The choices that people make about consciousness development during our current era will have consequences that extend far beyond their individual lives. Dr. Barbara Marx Hubbard, whose work on conscious evolution we've referenced, has developed what she calls evolutionary circles. Small groups of people who work together to develop enhanced consciousness capabilities and to facilitate consciousness evolution in their communities. Her research has documented that these groups can develop collective intelligence capabilities that exceed what individual consciousness development can achieve. But perhaps more importantly, Hubbard's evolutionary circles appear to function as what she calls evolutionary acupuncture points. Small groups whose consciousness development activities have disproportionately large effects on the consciousness evolution of much larger populations. The enhanced awareness capabilities that develop within these groups seem to radiate outward through social networks and morphic fields, facilitating consciousness development in people who have no direct contact with the groups. This evolutionary acupuncture effect suggests that relatively small numbers of people who seriously engage with consciousness development practices could have profound effects on the consciousness evolution of entire populations. The ancient Lemurian civilizations might have understood this principle and designed their consciousness development system specifically to maximize these radiating effects. The cultural transmission protocols preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions include detailed instructions for how consciousness development practitioners can organize themselves to maximize their positive effects on larger communities. These protocols describe specific roles for different types of practitioners, methods for coordinating individual and group consciousness development activities, and procedures for ensuring that enhanced awareness capabilities spread effectively through social networks. Dr. Margaret Wheatley, whose research into community resilience we've referenced, has worked with contemporary groups to implement these traditional cultural transmission protocols. Her research has documented that communities organized according to these principles develop remarkable collective intelligence capabilities and demonstrate extraordinary resilience during periods of environmental and social stress. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Wheatley's work is her discovery that communities organized according to traditional consciousness development principles begin to function as what she calls islands of sanity during periods of social upheaval. These communities maintain clear thinking, effective decision-making, and constructive relationships even when surrounding social systems are fragmenting or becoming dysfunctional. This island of sanity effect might be the most practical immediate benefit of engaging with the consciousness development techniques preserved from ancient Lemuria, even if the larger cosmic and evolutionary implications we've been discussing prove to be speculative. The practical benefits of enhanced individual and collective awareness capabilities are demonstrable and immediately useful. People and communities who develop these capabilities report significantly enhanced quality of life, more satisfying relationships, greater creative expression, and more effective responses to practical challenges. The consciousness development techniques work as practical life improvement methods regardless of their larger evolutionary implications, but the oral traditions preserved from ancient Lemuria suggest that these practical benefits are just the beginning of what becomes possible when people seriously engage with consciousness development practices. According to these traditions, the enhanced awareness capabilities that develop through systematic practice eventually reach threshold levels that open access to what the traditions call deep time consciousness, awareness that can perceive and work with evolutionary processes that unfold over thousands or millions of years. Deep time consciousness allows practitioners to recognize their individual lives and immediate concerns within the context of much larger evolutionary processes. Instead of being overwhelmed by the apparent chaos and uncertainty of contemporary circumstances, people with deep time consciousness can recognize current challenges as temporary phases within evolutionary processes that are moving toward greater consciousness, integration, and creative expression. This evolutionary perspective provides what might be the most valuable gift that ancient Lemurian civilizations preserved for our current era: the understanding that consciousness evolution is not just possible, but inevitable. The challenges we're currently facing aren't signs that human civilization is failing, or that consciousness development is impossible. They're indicators that we're in the midst of an evolutionary transition that could result in forms of human awareness and capability that exceed anything we've previously achieved. The ancient knowledge preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions suggests that this evolutionary transition has been anticipated and prepared for by conscious beings throughout human history. The consciousness development techniques, the cultural transmission protocols, and the environmental prediction methods we've been examining are all components of a comprehensive preparation program designed to help human populations navigate evolutionary transitions successfully. Dr. Duane Elgin, a consciousness researcher who has studied the relationship between individual awareness development and social evolution, argues that our current historical period represents what he calls an evolutionary bounce point, a moment when the direction of human consciousness evolution could shift dramatically based on the choices that contemporary populations make about consciousness development. If enough people choose to engage seriously with consciousness development practices during our current era, human civilization could evolve toward forms of awareness and social organization that would be vastly more sophisticated, integrated, and creative than anything we've previously achieved. But if people choose to ignore or resist consciousness development opportunities, human civilization could stagnate or even regress toward less conscious and less capable forms of organization. The ancient Lemurian civilizations faced similar evolutionary choice points and successfully navigated consciousness evolution transitions that allowed them to develop the sophisticated awareness capabilities described in Pacific Islander oral traditions. Their success provides evidence that consciousness evolution transitions are possible, and that human populations can develop the capabilities needed to navigate them successfully. But their success also demonstrates that consciousness evolution requires conscious choice and deliberate practice. Enhanced awareness capabilities don't develop automatically in response to environmental pressures. They develop through conscious engagement with specific practices and techniques that facilitate consciousness development. The techniques and practices preserved from ancient Lemuria provide a tested methodology for facilitating consciousness evolution. But engaging with these methods requires more than intellectual understanding. It requires practical commitment to the disciplined practice needed for developing enhanced awareness capabilities. Dr. Ken Wilber, a consciousness researcher who has studied the relationship between individual development and collective evolution, argues that the consciousness development work that individuals do during evolutionary transition periods, like our current era, has implications that extend far beyond personal benefits. Individual consciousness development contributes to what he calls the collective consciousness field that influences the awareness capabilities of entire populations. According to Wilber's research, when significant numbers of people within a population develop enhanced consciousness capabilities, they create collective consciousness fields that make similar development easier for everyone within that population. These collective fields can facilitate consciousness evolution even for people who don't directly engage with consciousness development practices. This collective consciousness field effect means that the consciousness development work that any individual does during our current historical period contributes to evolutionary processes that could benefit all of humanity. The ancient Lemurian civilizations appear to have understood this principle and organized their consciousness development systems specifically to maximize these collective field effects. The cultural transmission protocols preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions include detailed instructions for how individual consciousness development activities can be coordinated to create powerful collective consciousness fields. These protocols describe specific practices for sharing enhanced awareness capabilities across communities, methods for amplifying individual consciousness development through group activities, and procedures for maintaining collective consciousness fields across generations. But perhaps the most profound aspect of these traditional protocols is their recognition that consciousness evolution is ultimately a collective process that benefits from individual participation, but extends far beyond individual achievement. The enhanced awareness capabilities that individuals develop become resources that can be shared with entire communities and contribute to evolutionary processes that affect entire species. This understanding transforms consciousness development from a personal spiritual practice into a form of evolutionary service that benefits not just individual practitioners, but the entire cosmic consciousness evolution process that ancient traditions understood as the fundamental purpose of existence. The real treasure of ancient Lemuria might not be lost cities or advanced technologies, but this understanding of consciousness development as evolutionary service and the practical techniques for engaging in this service effectively. These techniques provide a way for contemporary people to participate consciously in the evolutionary processes that are currently transforming human civilization and planetary systems. The question that remains is whether enough people will choose to engage with these consciousness evolution opportunities to facilitate the positive evolutionary transition that appears to be possible during our current historical period. The ancient knowledge preserved from Lemuria provides the methodology, but each individual must choose whether to apply it. That choice might determine not just individual futures, but the future of consciousness evolution throughout the cosmos. What makes this choice so urgent is that the window of opportunity for conscious participation in the Great Turning appears to be limited. The astronomical alignments and electromagnetic field changes that create optimal conditions for consciousness evolution don't remain stable indefinitely. According to the most precise calculations preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions, the current phase of enhanced evolutionary potential will reach its peak within the next several decades, and then begin to diminish. Dr. Rick Tarnas, a cultural historian who has studied the relationship between astronomical cycles and historical patterns, has identified correlations between major consciousness evolution events and specific planetary alignments that suggest these opportunities occur in waves rather than as continuous processes. The consciousness development capabilities that become easily accessible during evolutionary transition periods may become much more difficult to develop once the astronomical conditions that facilitate them begin to change. This timing factor adds urgency to our investigation of ancient Lemurian consciousness technologies. We're not just examining historical curiosities or theoretical possibilities. We're looking at practical methodologies that might be essential for taking advantage of consciousness evolution opportunities that exist right now, but may not be available much longer. The oral traditions describe how ancient Lemurian practitioners recognized when these evolutionary windows were opening and organized intensive consciousness development programs to help as many people as possible develop enhanced awareness capabilities before the optimal conditions ended. These programs weren't casual educational offerings. They were emergency preparation efforts designed to maximize consciousness, evolution achievements during limited time periods. Dr. Stanislav Grof, whose research into consciousness development we've referenced throughout this investigation, has observed similar patterns in contemporary consciousness evolution activities. People who begin serious consciousness development practices during our current era often report accelerated development timelines and access to awareness capabilities that seem to exceed what should be possible based on conventional development models. This acceleration effect suggests that we're indeed in a period when consciousness evolution is being facilitated by environmental conditions similar to those that existed during ancient Lemurian times. The electromagnetic field changes, the social pressures, and the technological developments of our current era are creating optimal conditions for consciousness development that might not recur for thousands of years. But taking advantage of these conditions requires more than just recognizing that they exist. It requires practical engagement with the specific techniques and practices that can facilitate consciousness evolution during these accelerated development periods. The methodologies preserved from ancient Lemuria provide tested approaches for maximizing consciousness development achievements during evolutionary transition windows. Dr. Joan Borisenko, a consciousness researcher who has studied the relationship between individual development and collective transformation, has developed intensive training programs based on traditional Pacific Islander consciousness development methods. Her research has documented that people who complete these programs during our current historical period demonstrate consciousness development achievements that would typically require decades of practice under normal conditions. The accelerated development timelines that Borisenko has observed align remarkably well with the patterns described in Pacific Islander oral traditions about consciousness evolution during the Great Turning. The tradition suggests that enhanced awareness capabilities that normally take years or decades to develop can be achieved in months or even weeks when optimal evolutionary conditions are present. But this acceleration also creates new challenges. Rapid consciousness development can be destabilizing if people aren't prepared for the psychological and social changes that accompany enhanced awareness capabilities. The ancient Lemurian civilizations developed sophisticated support systems for helping people navigate these rapid consciousness transitions safely and effectively. The cultural transmission protocols preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions include detailed guidance for managing rapid consciousness development processes. These protocols describe specific practices for maintaining psychological stability during accelerated awareness expansion, methods for integrating enhanced consciousness capabilities into daily life, and procedures for providing community support for people experiencing rapid consciousness evolution. Dr. Christina Groff, a consciousness researcher who has studied what she calls spiritual emergencies, has adapted these traditional support protocols for contemporary practitioners. Her research has documented that people who have access to appropriate support systems can navigate even very rapid consciousness development processes successfully and emerge with stable access to enhanced awareness capabilities. But perhaps the most important aspect of these traditional support systems is their recognition that rapid consciousness development is ultimately a collective process that requires community involvement and coordination. Individual consciousness evolution achievements become sustainable only when they're supported by communities that understand and value enhanced awareness capabilities. This community dimension of consciousness evolution brings us back to one of the most important aspects of the ancient Lemurian legacy: their understanding that consciousness development is not a personal achievement, but a collective responsibility that benefits entire communities and contributes to evolutionary processes that extend far beyond individual concerns. The Pacific Islander oral traditions describe how ancient Lemurian communities organized themselves specifically to support consciousness evolution for all their members. These weren't just social arrangements for mutual convenience, they were consciousness development technologies that maximize the evolutionary achievements that entire populations could reach. Dr. Peter Senge, whose research into organizational learning we've referenced, has studied contemporary communities that have organized themselves according to these traditional principles. His research has documented that communities designed to support collective consciousness development can achieve remarkable coordination capabilities and demonstrate extraordinary resilience during challenging circumstances. But more importantly, these consciousness-supporting communities appear to function as what Senga calls evolutionary laboratories, where new forms of human awareness and social organization can emerge and be tested. The enhanced consciousness capabilities that develop within these communities often represent innovations that could benefit much larger populations if they can be successfully transmitted through cultural networks. This evolutionary laboratory function might be the most important contribution that contemporary consciousness development communities can make to the larger evolutionary processes that appear to be accelerating around us. By creating spaces where enhanced awareness capabilities can develop and be refined, these communities generate innovations that could facilitate consciousness evolution for entire populations. The ancient Lemurian civilizations appear to have understood this principle and organized their societies specifically to maximize their evolutionary laboratory functions. The consciousness development achievements that emerged from these societies weren't just beneficial for the people who lived in them. They created templates and methodologies that could facilitate consciousness evolution for populations throughout the world and across vast time periods. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance research suggests that the consciousness development achievements of contemporary communities organized according to these principles could have similar far-reaching effects. Enhanced awareness capabilities that develop within these evolutionary laboratory communities create morphic fields that make similar development easier for people throughout the world. This morphic field amplification effect means that even relatively small communities of serious consciousness development practitioners could have profound impacts on the consciousness evolution of the entire human population. The ancient Lemurian knowledge preserved in Pacific Islander oral traditions provides guidance for organizing communities to maximize these amplification effects. But engaging with this ancient knowledge requires us to move beyond intellectual understanding to practical application. The consciousness development techniques, the community organization principles, and the cultural transmission protocols we've been examining aren't just interesting historical information. They're practical methodologies that can be applied in contemporary circumstances to facilitate consciousness, evolution achievements that could benefit individuals, communities, and the larger evolutionary processes that are currently transforming human civilization. Dr. Barbara Marks Hubbard, whose work on conscious evolution has guided much of our investigation, argues that our current historical period represents humanity's first opportunity to participate consciously in its own evolutionary development. Previous consciousness evolution events occurred primarily through unconscious responses to environmental pressures. But the global communication networks and information sharing capabilities that exist today make it possible for the first time for large numbers of people to understand evolutionary processes and choose to participate in them consciously. This conscious evolution opportunity is both unprecedented and time-limited. The environmental conditions, technological capabilities, and social circumstances that make conscious evolution possible during our current era may not recur for thousands of years. The choices that contemporary populations make about consciousness development could determine the direction of human evolution for millennia into the future. The ancient Lemurian civilizations faced similar conscious evolution opportunities and developed sophisticated methodologies for taking advantage of them. Their success provides evidence that conscious participation in evolutionary processes is possible, and that human populations can develop the awareness capabilities needed to guide their own evolutionary development toward positive outcomes. But their success also demonstrates that conscious evolution requires more than just individual consciousness development. It requires coordinated efforts by communities and populations that understand evolutionary processes and commit to supporting consciousness development as a collective responsibility. The knowledge preserved from ancient Lemuria provides tested methodologies for organizing these coordinated consciousness evolution efforts. The techniques and practices we've been examining aren't just individual development methods. They're components of comprehensive systems designed to facilitate consciousness evolution at community, regional, and eventually global scales. Dr. Ervin Laszlo, whose research into cosmic consciousness evolution has informed our investigation, argues that the consciousness evolution achievements that occur during our current era could influence the development of consciousness throughout the universe. The enhanced awareness capabilities that human populations develop could contribute to cosmic evolution processes that extend far beyond planetary systems. This cosmic perspective transforms our understanding of why engaging with ancient Lemurian consciousness technologies might be important. We're not just working on personal development or even community improvement. We're potentially participating in evolutionary processes that could affect the development of consciousness throughout the cosmos. The oral traditions preserved from ancient Lemuria suggest that their civilization understood this cosmic dimension of consciousness development and organized their consciousness evolution efforts specifically to maximize their contributions to universal consciousness evolution processes. Their sophisticated knowledge preservation systems were designed to ensure that consciousness development achievements could contribute to cosmic evolution across vast spatial and temporal scales. If we choose to engage seriously with the consciousness development opportunities that appear to be available during our current era, we could be participating in the same cosmic evolution processes that ancient Lemurian civilizations contributed to thousands of years ago. Our individual consciousness development achievements could become part of a universal consciousness evolution project that spans geological and astronomical timescales. But making this contribution requires more than just intellectual appreciation of the possibilities involved. It requires practical commitment to the consciousness development practices that can facilitate enhanced awareness capabilities and to the community organization efforts that can amplify individual development achievements into collective consciousness evolution. The ancient knowledge preserved from Lemuria provides guidance for both individual consciousness development and collective evolution efforts. But this guidance becomes effective only when it's applied through sustained practical engagement, rather than just studied as interesting historical information. The window of opportunity for conscious participation in the Great Turning appears to be open right now, but it won't remain open indefinitely. The astronomical alignments, electromagnetic field changes, and social conditions that facilitate consciousness evolution are time-limited phenomena that occur in cycles measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years. The question that each of us faces is whether we'll choose to engage with these consciousness evolution opportunities while they're available, or whether we'll let them pass and wait for the next cycle to come around. The choices we make could determine not just our individual futures, but the future direction of consciousness evolution throughout the universe. The ancient Lemurian civilizations chose to engage fully with the consciousness evolution opportunities that were available during their era. Their achievements in developing enhanced awareness capabilities and sophisticated knowledge preservation systems demonstrate what becomes possible when populations commit seriously to conscious participation in evolutionary processes. Their legacy, preserved in the oral traditions and cultural practices of Pacific Islander populations, provides us with the methodologies needed to make similar achievements during our current evolutionary window. But having access to these methodologies doesn't guarantee success. Success requires practical application, sustained commitment, and collective coordination among people who understand the importance of consciousness, evolution for the future development of life and awareness throughout the cosmos. The real question isn't whether Lemuria was real in the sense of being a specific geographical location that existed at a particular time in the past. The real question is whether we'll choose to make real in our own lives and communities the consciousness, evolution achievements that ancient civilizations demonstrated were possible. The techniques exist, the opportunities are present. The only question that remains is whether we'll have the wisdom and courage to use them. That choice is ours to make, and the time to make it is now.